Okay, hello everyone. I think we're live now. So thanks for joining us for our next session. This is Deborah Southwell with We Need to Talk About Women in Wargames. I'm very excited to see what Deborah is going to be sharing with us today. So take it away, Deborah.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks everyone that's here. I can't see you, so I'm not too sure how many people are here, but I shall progress ahead anyway. I've got this title, We Need to Talk About Women in War Games, and talking about whether it's a game changer or is it. Sometimes I think we can talk about some of these issues, but we never actually get to moving on. So one of the things that I'm wanting to do today is look at some game design principles and look at some of the challenges and aspects to consider. And they're two sort of different topics, but they're related. So there's about the games and if you're designing games, but there's also some challenges and aspects to consider in that. What I've asked Becky is if we can, after I've spoken, taken us through the slides, whether we can actually be unmuted so that we can have a bit more of a discussion and come up with some ideas and some things to think about going forward. Hopefully some actions for all of us as we're going forward. I think it's very important that I position myself so that you know a bit more about me, a bit more about where I'm coming from, and what are some of the influences that impact on how I view this topic. So I am a woman, I'm middle class, I'm white, cisgendered. According to statistics, I'm old, I'm 65 years old, actually hearing impaired. I'm the eldest of 5. I had to have 2 sisters and 2 brothers. I'm the mother of 4 children, a daughter and 3 sons. I'm a grandmother of 8 kids, 5 of whom are boys and 3 girls. I'm Western, British Australian dual citizen. I have had domestic and religious abuse in my past. My school experiences were in a mixed school, but in the 60s, early 60s, and all the boys played on the football ground and at the marble patch, and all the girls had the basketball netball courts, and never the two would meet. When I got to high school, it was the beginning of a lot of the movements in the women's liberation of the late 60s and 70s. And I can remember very vividly a couple of the girls hanging bras out from the Home Economics building, and the male deputy having to climb up the outside of the building to get these bras down. And that was the first time that I was really made aware of there was something going on in the area of women and our rights and that sort of thing. In my first year of high school, women teachers finally got the same pay as the men. Women teachers, once they married, were actually allowed to stay in their jobs and keep teaching, instead of having to leave once they got married. So from sort of this sort of early start and early influences, and also being brought up in a very typical family of the time when my mum stayed at home and looked after us kids, things have changed a lot, especially for middle class white women. But we still have a long way to go. I just mentioned also in terms of my background that I do have qualifications up to a doctorate level in the areas of education and science, in human services, theology and business. I was the first in my whole family who actually went beyond what would be O levels here. So in that sense was challenging some of the things, not only in society, but also in my family, of I shouldn't be rising above my station in life. Over recent years, I've become a mega game player. I think I'm allowed to call myself that. You'll notice I didn't put ER after game design. I wouldn't class myself as a mega game designer yet, but I have started doing some game design and play tested my first game last week, which at Chestnut Lodge it was, and the guys there were very, very encouraging. But that's my position, and because it's my position, I can't speak for all women. I can't speak for all people. And I've listed here, you know, I can't speak for the experiences of Black, Asian, and other ethnicities, for younger people, for LGBTQI people, for women of other classes, and really can't talk for the middle-aged woman next door. All I can do is share my story and my perspective, but I can't generalize it to everybody else. And I think that's one of the important things that I'd like people to take away, is that our experience is important for each of us, male, female, and everything in between. It's more the aspect of we need to listen to other people's stories and to reflect on our own experience and how those experiences actually influence how we are in our lives and what we believe and what we think. So I did say that I'd look at some principles. So I'm just moving on to this as a first design principle. And that's about agency for all in the games that are designed. And this comes out very much, a lot of, we've had quite a bit of discussion in various different contexts about the roles of women and how to include more women in the games, how to get more women doing design. And a lot of discussion occurred after what I would tend to think as a good exemplar of good intentions that might have gone wrong in one of the games, in terms of a lot of the women were playing one particular game, and we were in roles that meant that we didn't actually have a lot of agency. The role that I was in was to make a good marriage and to have a son. And once I'd made the good marriage and had the son, that was pretty much my game over, until my husband in the game was killed, in which case I suddenly had a lot of men very interested in having my hand in marriage. And as soon as I was remarried, again, my game basically finished. And it's interesting, I think, to think, okay, so what was my agency? Was to have sons, and all I was allowed to do was have one son. So I did talk to the game designer and said, if that's the only thing that I can do, then I need to be able to have more sons. It wasn't the most exciting game. I have already had children, as I've said, but in many ways there were other aspects that were very difficult, and I'll come to some of those a bit later. But I think that agency for all, and the questions there is, as a designer, when we think about some of the roles that we might be wanting to create, either for women playing a female role, for women who you might want to give options about games, or for men that might be interested in playing a female role, you know, if you were giving a man this role, would there be plenty to keep them busy and keep them occupied and keep them engaged? And if there's not, if it's basically, you know, the equivalent of the getting married and have a baby, why would a woman be interested in playing that game? And I think it's not just women, it's any of those groupings, you know, sort of whether it's ethnicity, whether it's ability or disability, all of those sorts of things. You know, why would a person want to play that? What's the agency? And that being a big focus that as designers, I think is really important to look at, that it's a great game, no matter which character someone is playing. Another principle, and I do a lot of writing, and I think the whole aspect of character development is really important. One of the things I've said here, because I think sometimes it is hard to get into the mind of, for women to get into the mind of a man, for a man to get into the mind of a woman, you know, what is it that are those sorts of characteristics and ways of thinking? How do you think about design from those various perspectives? And I know I'm raising questions and not necessarily providing answers, but I think it's important to think about this. You know, if your male characters gather around a military map, what are your female characters gathering around? Is it a political map? Is it a map of the famous salons and where they might be able to have influence? I think in most areas, in most times in history, there have been very influential women, and it's worth knowing in the areas that you're interested in, historically or current or future, what are other sorts of things that you would imagine female characters being involved in? Who would be their allies? Who is the conflict with? That's where stories often come from the conflict. So who are the allies of the women? Who are the ones that they're in conflict with? I did want to also talk about just, I was talking with a person a couple of months ago who thought that their main approach was, let's just make games gender neutral. And I think that, that certainly would be one solution. But I don't know if that's actually is the best way towards inclusivity. And I wonder if it's actually ignoring the fact of gender, of sexuality, of what that means, of what it means to be included and what it means to be excluded, and some assumptions around, a woman playing a game as a gender neutral character would be treated the same way as a male playing a game around a gender neutral character. I think there's things that are beyond mega games that are part of our high society that actually mean that we treat men and women differently, regardless of what we're sometimes consciously aware of. And so that both will get a bit of a different experience of the game. Anyway, you might disagree, but that's what I think would be the situation. I think, in a way, just choosing to go gender neutral stops us from actually getting a better understanding of what the experience is of other people. Whether it's a race, whether it's like the ethnicity, whether it is a different sexuality, whether it is a different class. There's so many differences or different ability. What is it like to live that person's life? What is it like to live as a person who has a disability in our culture? What was it like in the times when in this historical period? And do we want to replicate that, or what ways would we adjust what we're doing? Which will come to the next design principle that I'm wanting to look at. I also think that some people enjoy playing a game that's, they enjoy playing their role as a female or enjoy playing their role as a male. I think sometimes people actually enjoy playing the role of a man if they're a woman, or a woman, a woman's role as a man, because it gives them a chance to sort of try on what it's like. But I still think we get this subtle differences between the treatment of men and women. So my next design principle. Oh yeah, one of the things I was going to suggest, and this comes from my writing background, is reading biographies of real people and using that to sort of as a way to get into a female character's role, for example. I remember a woman actually talking about one of our cricketers. She was trying to get into the head of an alpha male, and it was sort of like Steve Waugh was one of our Australian cricket captains, and a brilliant leader. And she would think about, okay, what would Steve Waugh do in this situation? So because she'd got to know him so well as a person, as a character, through what had been written about him. So finding out, reading biographies about women, and there are a lot of good biographies about women, to find out more about how a woman might think, if you're not that familiar with that, is another way that you might like to think about it. Now the next one, oh, sorry, I'm juggling a couple of screens here. One of the things that I think is very important is to be clear about the constraints of your game. And I think it might have been Becky that actually made the point in the discussion about people with disabilities last night, that, if we're up front about what our game experience is going to be. I think that's very helpful for people about to play a game or to deciding to join a game. One of the things that's been discussed in some of the contexts that I've been in is the history example. How faithful do you want to be to the history of a game, or to the history of the game that you're trying to that you've designed? And what's important about that? Is it more important to be faithful to the history, or could you be more flexible about how the roles are cast, so that you still get the experience of what it might be to be involved in some medieval context, but you're not necessarily constrained by the same gender rules as they were then? I know there's a classic case of the woman who wasn't allowed to go up to be a bishop because she was a woman. And how important is that? I'll just flip back. That's that one. In your approach. And if it's something that you think is critical, have that up front in the game material that you send out, so that if an aspect of sexism or racism or any other sort of otherism is being looked at, that you're clear that this is one of the constraints in the game. Better to be upfront than to be caught on the hop in the situation. So there's some of the design principles that I was thinking about. But I wanted to move to this area of the context that you're actually playing your game in. And one of the things, you may have heard of the term of microaggressions. There's been some writing that's now looking at the term subtle and not so subtle, I think, acts of exclusion, the SAE, meaning the same thing. But I think the writers were feeling that microaggressions sounded a bit aggressive, and that they're looking at it from the aspect of their subtle acts of exclusion was more inclusive and less inflammatory or less likely to trigger people when talking about what's happening. I think one of the fundamental things is that, none of us are necessarily going around committing the big crimes. Recently we've had the story in London, we've had some awful things happening in Australia in terms of the treatment of women in our government by our politicians. And we can look at those. We can look at the recent murder here in London, and we can be thinking, well, we're not sexist, we're not racist, we're not that bad. We would never do anything like that. And it's not that I'm saying that we're not good people. We are all good people. It's not that we're necessarily intending to hurt people. But sometimes we do things because of numerous things that we might not be aware of, because of our upbringing, because of the way that our broader society works. And when our politicians can abuse women in their parliament and get away with it for years, there's something wrong with the system more broadly. But when we're talking to each other in a mega game, we're not thinking that this is the level of abuse that's happening, but there's still things that go on that exclude people. And someone once said to me, the people in the Spanish Inquisition, they also had good intentions. They had wanted to save these people that were thinking wrong in their religion so they could go to heaven. And that really struck me, because I thought, yeah, we might think we've got good intentions, but at the end of the day, what's the actual impact of what we're doing, and what's the impact of what we might say or what we might do? Which brings me to the other two aspects of organizational accountability and individual accountability. My daughter's quite high up in an organization in Australia. She's just employed somebody, and as part of the employment, and this will be the sort of the main out of game thing that happened, she was told that the woman she wanted to appoint had asked for the parental leave information for the organization. And the person in HR who should have known a lot better, said to my daughter, did she still want to go along and employ her? So even in this day and age, that sort of thing is happening. And that obviously the HR person thought it was still an all right thing to discriminate against a woman who might be thinking of having children or may have been pregnant in a job that she was very, very able to do. My daughter dresses quite glamorously and like her mother, and they had a dress down Friday. She turned up to work in jeans and had the company t-shirt on. And when she went in to see her boss about something, he immediately turned around and said, "Where's the glam?" And she just looked at him and said, "It's, dress down Friday." And it came back, "Yeah, but where's the glam?" And it's sort of like not realizing, I'm sure he did not realize what he was doing. Helen just reminded her that it was a dress down Friday and walked out. So things happen at the organizational level, things happen at that micro level. And these are the sorts of things, I think, if we think about it in the mega game context, what as a group, whether a whole group of mega gamers or at our local mega gamer group, do we need to put in place around our accountability as an organization? And here we're talking about gender. And also, what do we need to put in place around the individual level? There was a situation at one mega game where there was an incident where, as part of the game, one of the men said something to one of the women about being able to get her pregnant. In the context, there's no justifying it really. It was a very, at best, it was a very ill-considered comment that was made. It very much distressed the woman concerned. And also no one else around said anything. And I think there's a number of issues there. It would be good if the woman had known how to perhaps say something back, but we shouldn't always expect the person who's at the receiving end of some sort of exclusion to be the person that has to defend themselves. What I found really distressing about that, but there are other people around, some of these good people with good intentions, who didn't actually say anything. And in some cases, or in most cases, I think, the people around, the men had to actually call the guy on what he had said. And sometimes those people around don't know what to say either, or don't realise what the impact has been on the person who's been on the receiving end of that sort of a comment. And so what do we need to put in at that more organisational level so that people can feel safe and feel that they've got someone that they can turn to? This woman didn't feel like she had anyone she could turn to, was extremely distressed. And what can be done at the individual level around people becoming more comfortable to be able to defend themselves through the people. And in this context, we're talking about men and women. So we'll talk about the men in the group calling other men on that sort of behaviour. How do we deal with those levels? So it's not just within the game, but the whole environment around the game, so that it becomes safer, not just for women, but that's what we're talking about, but safer for any individual who is in some form of minority group. And I think, to me, that's a big issue for us to be able to think about as well. So, and I was just thinking, just to get some, before I go on to our discussion points, I'll give you a couple of examples of some things that I have been involved in that I think, well, I'll give you this one particular example. As I've said, I'm Australian. I've spent most of my life in Australia. worked in universities, and in one particular university, it was certainly the first in Australia, I think it may have been the first in the world, that actually brought in what's called an ally scheme. And this ally scheme was for particularly staff members to join the program, to be involved in some developmental sort of experiences, so that they could be allies or support people for other staff members who identified themselves as LGBTQI. And I volunteered to be a part of that program. It was a really interesting experience. It was interesting from the perspective of what I learned, but it was also interesting from the responses other people had to me taking that position as an ally, and the misunderstandings of what that meant as well for some of those people. But it was a scheme that was just very encouraging also for those people that identified as LGBTQI, that they knew that there were people that they could turn to for support if things became such that they needed that level of support. And that was a really good scheme. I was interested last night, I think it was Jen mentioned in the, and I might be wrong, it might have been one of the others in the group around disabilities, about some sort of player support, and that the person who is the person responsible for new players at a game could also be the sort of player support for, well, in that case last night, people with disabilities, but they could also be the sort of person that's there to provide that sort of support to women, people with disabilities, any group that could be excluded deliberately or unintentionally, to support players, new players, and people that have been there for a while. I think then we need to think about what sorts of attributes that person would need and what sort of development opportunities might be important for them. In the same way, at the individual level, we need to think about, for those of us that might be in a situation where we could be marginalised or excluded, how we manage that in situations with other people around. And then, I think the bystander, moving from being the bystander to being the ally, even if it's not a formal position as such, like, the first person, the new person contact, how do we learn ways to be able to intervene in a respectful way to the person that might have said something that was exclusionary, or help work through some of those very difficult conversations with good people with good intentions, but who have actually hurt somebody. How do we do that in the mega game context that we are in? So, so the questions I've got are, how do we actually move from discussion to action? We can talk about it, but I think getting some concrete ways forward, and there's a number of different ways forward. I've just mentioned that particular one. And what can we put in place to encourage and support, not just support inclusion, but actually stop the exclusion, to make it that the norm is that we're inclusive. What do we need to do at the more organisational club level? What do we need to do at our own personal individual level? So, so Becky, would you like to open it up so that I might just stop my sharing if I can work out how to do that. Yep. No.
Yep, I'm just unmuting everyone. It will just be a minute. Don't feel like you need to actually unmute yourself at the moment that you get the notification. It's just giving you the permission to do so going forward. There we go. Yes. Thanks so much, Deborah. That was absolutely fantastic, and I think there's so many good points in there. I've been taking notes, to be honest, during this, and I do think there's been lots of really good things. Just to sort of maybe kick the discussion off, like, one of the things I found really interesting was what you said about the gender neutrality, and the fact that that can not always work in games. And I've wondered in the past whether, you know, just by saying let's make all of the roles gender neutral, whether that actually erases the issues in the past that women did face in terms of things. And
yeah. I mean, one of the classic ones is there's a number of things, and you know, I mean, I've got 3 sons that I love. I've got 5 grandsons that I love. I'm not against men in any way or form, but one of the things that probably many of the women are aware of is, in a work context, how often men will interrupt women when they're talking. And that's going to happen in a mega game, no matter how gender neutral the game design might be, that those sorts of behaviours will still happen. So it's, you know, we're dealing with a situation where there's long-standing behaviours that have been learnt by men, that have been learnt by women, women that won't make a fuss because they don't want to make a fuss. Women don't make a fuss. So they'll let the game go on, even though they might be feeling really upset, really hurt, really angry, really resentful. Yeah, there's both of those levels that I think we need to sort of grapple with.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I do, you know, a lot of the women that you see at mega games are very outspoken and very opinionated. I would count myself among them, and they're the sort of people that are very used to and very like, they're used to having to push their point forward even when they're being spoken over.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that you know, women who maybe are tired of having to do that, maybe are less good at it, would struggle more at mega games to get their point across, because, as you say, it's part of how mega game works. There's so much sort of around talking to people and pushing a point of view forward.
That's right. And I mean, I've worked in an environment that, you know, like at senior management, where there are a lot of men, and I'm very aware that I have developed the very bad habit of interrupting people myself. So it's one of those things that I'm working very hard at for myself, to try and part of that is the excitement of wanting to get back into the conversation, but it is a bad habit. It's I mean, to be quite honest, I feel like I'm terribly rude when I do it, but I still have got this habit of doing it. So I'm, you know, for myself, I need to learn that. But I think men, it's been such a cultural thing for them that it's quite hard. Now, Carolina, I don't know if you can see, I can see your screen, Becky, and I can see that Carolina's raised her hand, but I don't know if anyone else has either made a comment or got their hand up. So I'm quite happy to take a question or comment from people.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to go about it. If you do want to say something, if you just pop your hand up at the bottom of the screen, and yeah, Carolina, if you go first.
Actually, Becky, it's Seamus. We're both watching the talk on Carolina's computer.
Okay.
My apologies. Thank you, Deborah, for that excellent talk. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering, you were asking at the end there about concrete changes that could be made. And I was wondering, this is something that we've been talking about a bit in True North, and I think, Becky, we've spoken about it just privately. We floated the idea of a cross-network perma-ban list for problematic players. Now, we don't know how this would work with GDPR, we don't know how this would work with working with networks, but we feel that there's too much opportunity for players to do something problematic in a game, in a network somewhere, and then it kind of gets retained in perhaps the local memory, but it's not particularly widely reported. It's not really shared. There isn't a facility or a structure to share information about problematic players.
Yeah, that's I would imagine that would be quite a tricky one to have a register of anything of something like that, and it's that is a challenge. That is a challenging one. And do they themselves realize? Has someone spoken to them about it? How do you have that conversation with those people? about what's happened? Do you give them a second chance? How do you deal with that sort of thing? Be interested to know if anyone else has had similar problems or thoughts.
I can see, I think Dave's got his hand up.
Yeah,
next.
Dave and Jim.
Yeah.
And Jerry.
I was just going to say, you're right. It would not go down at all well with anybody who had anything to do with privacy or the GDPR. So I think it's a very good idea not to put it in writing or in an email. But there are not that many people running games around the place. So in the UK, I would have thought, you know, you could ring you could ring Seamus, you could ring Pennine, you could ring John Misen, you could ring just a few people, and you'd soon make sure if somebody, I'd probably get in trouble for saying any of this, but you'd soon make sure if there was somebody really that bad that you got the word around. If they were really that bad, of course, you'd have to go well beyond that.
Jim, what were your thoughts?
We have had, back in the day in Mega Game Makers, we've had the issue about what to do with players whose behaviour was utterly unacceptable. And it's in one sense, it's absolutely appropriate for a group to effectively blacklist somebody. I think the issue with sharing is segues a little bit into the issues last night, is that and issues of kind of openness and transparency. So as Deborah said, there's an initial stage which is address the behavior, call it out, because there's a risk that you go, well, I didn't like that very much, but I'm not going to say anything and we'll just blackball them. And I think that lacks a certain amount of honesty and transparency, and that's a difficult conversation. I absolutely understand that. And the other thing is that if I used to say, if we banned people for being a bit irritating, we'd never have anyone turn up to Mega Games. So there's where do you draw? Absolutely, you can see the ones where someone is being completely out of order. That's okay. You can kind of go, yeah, definitely blackball, not welcome here, behaves unacceptable. But it's like, well, I think the worrying part is the hearsay part, and of course the hearsay. This is what happens between organisations. So I've used serial abusers get away with it is because of a reluctance to share experiences of bad behaviour. So I think there should be a sharing and a transparency, but I can't help feeling it's a non-trivial question about setting standards. And I think there's a very important thing. And I noticed Jerry put the Derby House principles in as a link. In the professional wargaming field, there are increasingly organisations signing up to an agreed set of principles across the field. And I'm wondering if there's something that along those lines that might support groups who are saying, look, you signed up to these behavioural, these are our standards. If you can't meet them, then I'm afraid you're not welcome, and you won't be welcome anywhere else either. Over, that's me.
Yeah. Jerry.
Yeah, I'm going to just to extend it slightly further to say that there are other groups that are struggling with this principle now, and have done for some years. And I think, as anything with this, let's look at the experiences elsewhere and see if we can avoid reinventing the wheel and seeing how it's dealt with. The one for organisers in particular that I would say was worth a look at is actually the InterVarsity Folk Dance Festival community, which is an event that's been going on for years. It's actually the longest running folk festival in the UK, and it moves around from university to university, different one every year. And they have had the problem, to have to dealt with the problem. And the reason I know about it is I've actually been a member of the organising committee when it's been in Sheffield for several years, despite never being a member of Sheffield University, but that's another long story. But there are ways and ways of things that can be done. And one of those is that there's a very clear code of conduct, which addresses the issues of who are the right people to actually investigate allegations and what can be done about it. And I think the other things that we've still got the problems about the legality and of the rest of it. But I think the most important thing, which is the reason why I put the Derby House principles up, is basically there's something up in front that says we ain't going to tolerate this. And it's then up to all of the people involved to find out and learn when's the appropriate time to say something and what's the time to do. One of the things about the talking over, and I'm guilty as sin for not being quiet and for opening my gob, is though when somebody else is being talked over, you can support that person by simply reporting, did you not hear what Deborah just said? Those sort, and I think there are some tools that we could share. Quite a lot of it has been done by within the professional community within the Derby House rules. There's some one of the reasons that I put the pack sims up is because there's a lot of stuff on that particular website that's worth looking at, from the cards. There's just so much stuff, and we could spend a lot of time going there. But I think the main thing is that you have to acknowledge we're all at fault. We all have some degree of responsibility. There are the things that we have to say, that's what we do it. Within Pennine MegaGames, we've had the discussions, and again, Becky, from a Pennine MegaGame perspective, I'm more than happy that whatever we've done is shared with anybody else that wants to know about it. In fact, that was part of the whole point, was that we wanted to start this idea of saying, hey, look, guys, there are some things that are happening that we're really not comfortable about, and let's try and make the games a better place to be.
Yeah.
I think I'll leave it at that for the moment. There are various other things, and I'm more than happy to talk to people afterwards, because we're going to run out of time on this.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you, Jerry. And I think that sharing of good practice is a really good idea. Terry, you did have your hand up.
Sorry, just quickly before we go on to Terry, I just wanted to say, if you don't want to talk out loud and you just want to pop things in the chat, then feel free. There's absolutely no obligation, obviously, to say things out loud. And there have been a couple of things that have been mentioned in the chat, like Patrick said. UK groups have got, a lot of the UK groups have got a code of conduct, as Jerry mentioned. Pennine has got one, and yeah, those being shared is great. Jim's mentioned that Sweden's got ground rules for mega games. Going and having a look at what other groups do. And then the other thing,
I think if we could grab this chat, Becky, says I interrupting. Sorry.
No worries.
Sorry. It just illustrates how even with good intentions, one still keeps doing things that aren't helpful. I was just wanting to make sure that we're able to capture the chat, because it'd be good to be able to share those links with each other, talking about sharing good practice. It's thinking about how we can actually do that, and it'd be good to grab some of that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'll get a copy of. Sorry, I'll get a copy of all of these links at the end of this. Let's go on to. I think we haven't heard from Rob yet. So if we go to Rob before we go back to either Dave or Carolina Seamus.
Yeah, thank you, Rob.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving this talk. It's been really interesting so far. And I just wanted to ask. I know that obviously a big emphasis. One of the things that MegaGames is seen as doing again and again are very much male, pale and stale blokes in high command or top levels of dynasties, shuffling around armies, smashing the hell out of each other. Yes. What kind of alternative settings or games would be appreciated to try and get a bigger female audience? Because I thought Trope High did that really well. And is there anything in particular which could that you think could make for good mega games which appeal more to women?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question about what sort of games appeal to women. Unfortunately, I put my name up on my my picture there instead of my my usual nickname, which is Pirate Queen 55. The very first game I played was Relics of the Falls, and I was so excited because I could sort of be, this sort of who was it? Imperia Furiosa from none of the Mad Max things. The sorts of games that I would like to play is if I can be the pirate, if I can be the space person that's going to save the universe. I like all of those action ones. The ones that don't appeal to me quite so much are the ones where we might sit around a table and talk to each other and have some sort of big political discussion. I know men who like those ones where it's political and there's lots of influence, rather than the active ones. I know women that really like the active ones, and sometimes it's not necessarily games that women would prefer that are different from what men would prefer. A lot of it will come down to the roles and what they might be able to do. That's my perspective, and I'd invite any of the other ladies that are on there to say what sort of games they like, because I think getting the different perspectives would be useful for the men that are designers that are on here. So would any of the ladies like to share what sort of games that they would, unless their husbands are sitting behind their names or their partners behind their names. So I don't know if Sue Ganley is Sue or a partner or a brother or.
No, sorry, I was just guffawing. It's Bernie.
Oh, hi, Bernie.
It's the family email.
And you couldn't put a falsetto on and sort of say?
No.
Bernie, in fact, did a very lovely play test recently. It must be a couple of months ago. But it was about the salons, wasn't it, Bernie?
Yeah, it was the Napoleonic salons of the First Empire. And what it was about were 6 powerful women who were, in many ways, key decision makers and not just breeding factories within the setting. And people like Laura Junot, who wrote one of the most set of scandalous memoirs of the period and was called The Petty Pest by Napoleon. And she was forever intriguing. And the other one was some of you who've probably done 19th century history, Madame de Staël, who was the biggest opponent to Napoleon for his entire time. He said he only feared 2 things, Talleyrand and de Staël.
Yeah. And I've just noticed Barbara's put in the chat, it is those key female roles or roles that could be female. Different women will be interested in different games, just like men are interested in different games. And I see Terry's put a comment in chat as well. But to go back to this aspect of the types of games, sometimes the women will be reluctant to. I know the first couple of times when I played games and I've been put in the main role, especially the first time I had any attempt at one of these things. And I was just totally horrified. I mean, it's sort of unfortunate that I've had a lot of experience with management roles and just sort of went into management role of this crew on a spaceship and delegated everything. But sometimes having, the women won't necessarily put themselves forward sometimes, but perhaps having them in a key role with an experienced advisor who is either a woman that's played a lot or one of the men that's played a lot, so that she's getting some useful advice from the offsider, but it is actually a woman that's having a go at some of their stronger roles. Might be a way around that as well. What have you found, Becky?
So firstly, I just want to say we've got about 7 minutes left, okay. But we will obviously be carrying on this conversation, I'm sure, in the pub afterwards. For me, the sort of games that I like to play are... So before I started Megagaming, honestly, it was a tutors game that brought me along to Megagaming in the first place. And I heard of Watch the Skies. I was told about Watch the Skies ahead of time. And I was like, that doesn't sound like the sort of thing that interests me at all. Geopolitics doesn't interest me. Aliens, can give or take them. But after coming to my first Mega game, that was what made me think, oh, actually, I just love Mega games. I don't really care what the theme is, even if it's not something that interests me. I want to come along to it. And I think it's not so much about theme for a lot of people. I think it's about the way it's pitched, because if it's pitched as something that I'd be able to find something of interest within it, something like well, I'm very into diplomacy roles. I'm very into the politics side of things. Mm-hmm. If it's pitched with that, then I'm much more likely to sign up to the game than if it's pitched. If it's pitched and looking at the language that you're using, it's you see it a lot in like job articles. You're not supposed to say things like rock star and things like that, because that's sort of very sort of male-oriented languages and things, and thinking about the language that you're using to promote your game. Are you using language that will appeal more to men, versus classically more to men than to women?
Yeah.
I'm
sorry, Becky. Sorry.
Yeah,
No, I was just going to say that I think, hi, I'm Carolina here. Thank you, Deborah, for your brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm very similar to you both, actually, in that I do like diplomacy and politics and negotiation much more than I like the military rule-focused kind of gameplay, I guess. And I do agree that it's not so much theme only, but also that, yeah, I agree with Becky on that. And I would just like to say as well that for the continuation of this theme, that this discussion, that it is very important to discuss non-male players within our community. And yeah, we will in True North our symposium on the 24th of April, we are having a gender discussion as well, gender equality, which I think is kind of in a continuation of this conversation, and one that we had begin last year as well. Yeah.
Well, that sounds great. I am conscious time's going to run out. But yeah, I think this is a continued conversation, and I really would encourage you to sort of think it's not just the conversation, but what's the next step? What's, each little step forward will take us further. So thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the conversation. And
thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you, everyone.
That's fine. Thank you, everyone. That's great.
Just very quickly, later on this evening, we've got at 9 p.m. we've got our Mr. Mega Game will be interviewing Andrew Shield-Dodds from True North about how his run of Red Planet Rising, which I think is possibly ending momentarily. No, wait, is going on for a few more hours. Sorry, got my timings completely wrong. Yeah. So yeah, tune in for that later, and yeah, we'll see you in the pub. And thanks again, once again, Deborah.
Yeah, great. Thank you.